Some things are left behind for a reason. When I first arrived at Beacons Point Lighthouse 3 months ago, I thought I was getting the opportunity of a lifetime solitary work, decent pay, and endless ocean views that most people only dream. About the isolation seemed like a blessing after years of city noise and crowded apartments. What I didn't expect was the folded piece of yellowed paper tucked inside the operations manual, written in shaky handwriting that looked more like a desperate confession than professional guidance. 7 rules numbered carefully, each one stranger than the last. But tonight, as I write this by candlelight because the generator has mysteriously failed again, I understand why my predecessor left them. I understand why 3 keepers before him disappeared without a trace. And I understand why the Maritime Authority struggles to keep this position filled. The paper feels different now when I touch it heavier somehow, as if the words themselves carry weight. The ink seems darker than when I first read it, though that might just be my imagination playing. Tricks in this endless darkness that surrounds the lighthouse after sunset. You'd think a lighthouse would be bright, wouldn't you? But darkness has a way of creeping into every corner here, seeping through stone walls that have stood for over a century, whispering through gaps in the windows that no amount of weather stripping seems to seal. Before you dismiss this as the ramblings of another lighthouse keeper gone maddened, believe me, I've heard the stories about my predecessors. Let me share something that will test everything you think you know about the natural world. Did you ever wonder what happens to the light when it travels across an empty ocean, reaching nothing but endless water and vacant horizon? Where does that light go when there's no ship to guide, no shore to illuminate? The answer isn't as simple as you might think, and it's certainly not something they teach in their brief orientation sessions. Subscribe to witness what lurks beyond the beam's reach, because some stories choose their audience carefully. I want to know, can you guess which of the 7 rules I broke first? The rule that opened my eyes to what this lighthouse truly guards. The first person to answer correctly will receive a small reward from me, the storyteller. Tanita's a way of saying thank you for watching and supporting. Tell me where you are right now as you listen to this. What time is it in your corner of the world? And are you alone like I am out here? I'm curious how many of you are brave enough to listen to this story in the dark, because darkness changes everything about how we perceive reality. Some rules exist to protect us from ourselves. The first rule was simple enough: never look directly at ships passing during the 3 a.m. hour, for they carry passengers who should have drowned long ago. The second warned against counting the light rotations after midnight. Apparently numbers have power here that mathematics never taught us. Rule 3 forbade opening any windows during heavy fog, though it never explained why the fog seemed to press against the glass like something alive trying to get in. The fourth rule was, perhaps, the most unsettling: never descend to the basement levels after the sun sets, because what sleeps down there should remain undisturbed. Rule 5 seemed almost laughable at first: never extinguish the main beacon completely. Not even for maintenance, until I learned what the darkness brings when left unchecked. The 6th rule cautioned against writing in the official logbook with anything other than black ink, as if the color itself held significance in this place where reality bends like light through a prism. And the 7th rule, the one that chilled me most when I first read it: never leave the lighthouse unmanned until you find a suitable replacement. For the beacon must always have a keeper, and the keeper must always tend the beacon. Isolated men who'd spent too much time staring at the horizon. The Maritime Authority had mentioned that previous keepers had left under unusual circumstances, but I assumed they meant the standard occupational hazards of lighthouse keeping storms, equipment failures, the psychological strain of isolation. I had no idea that unusual circumstances was their polite way of saying that men had walked into the ocean never to return, or that one keeper had been found at the top of the beacon. Somehow fused with the light mechanism itself, his flesh transformed into something that still pulsed with an otherworldly glow. The first rule seemed harmless enough until my 3rd night on duty, when I learned why previous keepers had underlined it 3 times in increasingly frantic handwriting. At 2:47 a.m., I was performing my routine maintenance check on the beacon mechanism when I noticed a ship's lights on the horizon, moving steadily toward the rocky coastline below. Standard protocol required me to monitor any vessel approaching during night hours, ensuring they maintained safe distance from the jagged rocks that had claimed dozens of ships over the decades. But something about this particular ship felt wrong from the moment I spotted it. The lights were too dim, flickering like dying candles rather than the steady brightness of modern navigation equipment. The vessel moved with an eerie stillness, cutting through the waves without creating the usual wake patterns that should have been visible even from this distance. I reached for the binoculars hanging beside the observation window, my hands already moving toward the powerful telescope mounted on the beacon platform. The first rule echoed in my mind: never look directly at ships passing during the 3 a.m. hour, for they carry passengers who should have drowned long ago. But professional duty overrode superstition, and I told myself that a ship in distress required immediate attention, regardless of what time the clock showed. The moment I focused the telescope on the vessel, reality shifted in ways that still make my hands tremble when I try to write about it. The ship wasn't modern at all. It was a 19th century merchant vessel, complete with 3 masts and tattered sails that billowed in winds I couldn't feel from my position high above the ocean. Worse still, the deck was crowded with figures that stood motionless despite the ship's movement through the choppy waters. Even at this distance, I could see they wore period clothing, waterlogged and torn, their faces turned upward toward my lighthouse with expressions of desperate longing. Their mouths moved in unison, as if calling out words I couldn't hear but somehow understood in the deepest part of my soul. They were pleading for something: salvation, perhaps, or simply acknowledgement that they still existed in whatever form death had left them. The ship passed directly beneath the lighthouse beam, and for one horrifying moment, the light seemed to bend downward, drawn toward the vessel like iron filings to a magnet. In that illuminated instant, I saw the passengers clearly: men, women, and children whose skin had taken on the pale green hue of deep ocean water, whose eyes reflected the lighthouse beam with an intensity that belonged to predators rather than victims. They reached upward with arms that moved too fluidly, as if their bones had been replaced by something more suitable for underwater existence. One figure stood apart from the others, positioned at the ship's bow with arms outstretched toward my lighthouse. Even through the telescope, I recognized the uniform of a lighthouse keeper, complete with the brass buttons that caught and reflected my beacon's light. His face was turned directly toward me, and I realized with growing horror that he could see me watching, his mouth open in what might have been a scream or a laugh, revealing rows of teeth that had been sharpened to needle points. He raised one hand and pointed directly at me, then gestured toward the ship's deck as if inviting me to join their eternal voyage. The invitation felt tangible, almost magnetic, pulling at something deep in my chest that wanted nothing more than to leap from this tower and fall into their waiting arms. I jerked away from the telescope so violently that I knocked over the maintenance toolbox, sending wrenches and screwdrivers clattering across the beacon room floor. Back toward the horizon, the ship had vanished completely, leaving only empty ocean and the steady rhythm of waves against rocks. But the lighthouse beam continued to flicker for another 10 minutes, pulsing in a pattern that seemed almost like Morse code, spelling out messages I was afraid to decipher. I checked every piece of equipment twice, convinced that some mechanical failure had caused hallucinations brought on by electromagnetic interference or carbon monoxide poisoning, but the machinery hummed with perfect efficiency. The air quality monitors showed normal readings. The ship's passage had been recorded by the automated tracking system, a 19th century merchant vessel moving at impossible speeds through waters that should have torn apart anything less than a modern steel hull. The logbook held answers I wasn't prepared to find, written in the trembling hands of men who had stood exactly where I now stand, watching the same impossible ships sail through waters that defied every law of physics and nature. Began with such mundane details: weather conditions, routine maintenance, supply deliveries, before descending into increasingly frantic observations that read more like confessions than professional documentation. Thomas Whitmore, keeper from 1987 to 1989, started his tenure with neat, precise handwriting that gradually deteriorated into barely legible scrawl. His final entries spoke of voices calling from the water during the darkest hours, promising rest to those who joined them in the depths. Margaret Chen, who had replaced him, lasted only 8 months, before her writing became consumed with calculations, obsessive tallies of the beacon's rotations, as if she were trying to decode some hidden message in the lighthouse's mechanical rhythm. Her last entry was a single word repeated 347 times, counting, 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 until the word lost all meaning and became merely ink bleeding across the page like dark tears. The most disturbing entries belonged to David Harrow, my immediate predecessor, whose careful documentation revealed the slow psychological erosion that seemed to afflict every keeper who stayed longer than a few months. He had started by dismissing the rules as superstition, just as I had, methodically testing each prohibition to prove his rationality in the face of maritime folklore. His entries chronicled each violation in clinical detail, describing phenomena that transformed from mildly unusual to absolutely terrifying as the months progressed. Rule violations weren't random acts of rebellion, they were compulsions that grew stronger with each passing night, as if the lighthouse itself were whispering suggestions that became increasingly difficult to ignore. Harrow's notes revealed patterns I was already beginning to recognize in my own behavior, the inexplicable urge to count the beacon's rotations after midnight, the way my hand moved toward window latches during foggy nights, the growing curiosity about what lay hidden in the basement levels that I had been explicitly told to avoid. His handwriting showed the same deterioration. I was beginning to notice in my own journal entries letters that slanted at odd angles, words that seemed to write themselves without conscious thought, margins filled with symbols that looked almost like architectural blueprints for structures that couldn't exist in normal space. The most chilling discovery came in a loose page tucked between the logbook's final entries. Written in Harrow's hand but using red ink that had been specifically forbidden by the sixth rule, the words seemed to pulse on the page as if they contained their own heartbeat. The lighthouse remembers every keeper who has served, and every keeper becomes part of its memory. We never truly leave this place. We become part of the light itself, casting our consciousness across the waters to guide others to the same fate that claimed us. I understand now why the beacon must never be extinguished completely. We live in that light, existing in the spaces between photons, watching new keepers arrive with the same naive confidence we once possessed. The previous entries described systematic rule-breaking that followed an almost ritualistic pattern, as if each keeper were unconsciously following a script written by forces beyond their comprehension. First came the compulsion to observe the 3 a.m. ships. Then the irresistible need to count beacon rotations, followed by an overwhelming urge to open windows during fog. Each violation seemed to unlock new levels of awareness, revealing layers of reality that remained hidden from those who followed the rules, but awareness came with a price the more a keeper saw, the less human they became, until they existed more in the lighthouse's supernatural dimension than in the physical world. The transformation wasn't sudden or dramatic. It was a gradual dissolution of individual identity that replaced human consciousness with something that served the lighthouse's mysterious purpose. My hands shook as I read Harrow's final entry, dated just 3 days before my arrival. Tonight, I break the 7th rule, not by leaving, but by ensuring that I never truly can. The replacement arrives soon, young and eager like we all were once. He will find these logbooks, read these warnings, and dismiss them as the ravings of isolated men driven mad by solitude. But madness is just another word for seeing too clearly, for understanding truths that comfortable reality prefers to keep hidden. I will be waiting in the light when he needs guidance, just as those before me waited for me. The 2nd rule revealed its true nature on my 7th night, when insomnia and curiosity conspired to lead me down a path that would fundamentally alter my understanding of mathematics, time, and the mechanical heartbeat that drives this ancient beacon through its endless rotations. It started innocently enough. I was lying in the small keeper's quarters, listening to the steady rhythm of the lighthouse mechanism as it swept its beam across the dark waters below, when I realized I was unconsciously counting each rotation in my head. 1, 2, 3, 4. The numbers seemed to pulse in rhythm with my heartbeat, creating a strange synchronicity that made me feel connected to the lighthouse's vital functions. The warning about never counting rotations after midnight seemed absurd in the face of such a natural human tendency to find patterns in repetitive sounds. But as the digital clock beside my bed clicked past 12:01 a.m., the counting became something more than idle observation. It transformed into a compulsion that felt as necessary as breathing. The lighthouse beam completed its circuit every 12 seconds during normal operation, casting light in a precise pattern that had remained unchanged for over a century. But as I continued counting in the darkness of my quarters, the timing began to shift in ways that defied the mechanical consistency of the beacon's motor-driven rotation. Sometimes the intervals stretched to 15 seconds, sometimes compressed to 8, as if the lighthouse were breathing with a rhythm that belonged to something alive rather than something constructed of steel and glass. At first I attributed the irregularity to my own imperfect timing, but the pattern became too pronounced to dismiss as human error. The lighthouse was deliberately altering its rotation speed, and somehow my counting was influencing these changes. When I reached 100 rotations, the beam began to linger in certain directions, pausing for several seconds longer when pointed toward specific coordinates on the horizon. At 200 counts, the lighthouse started rotating in the opposite direction for brief periods, casting light across sections of ocean that should have remained in darkness. The mechanical impossibility of these changes should have terrified me, but instead I felt an exhilarating sense of control, as if I were conducting an orchestra of light and shadow that responded to my mental commands. By the time I reached 300 rotations, the lighthouse began showing me things that existed beyond the normal spectrum of visible light.
Ow.
The beam revealed structures beneath the ocean's surface, geometric shapes that extended far below the deepest ocean trenches, connected by tunnels that formed a vast network spanning the entire continental shelf. Ancient buildings constructed from materials that reflected light in impossible ways, their surfaces covered with symbols that matched the marginalia I had found in the previous keeper's logbooks. These underwater cities pulsed with their own illumination, responding to the lighthouse beam like deep-sea creatures communicating through bioluminescence. At 400 counts, I began to see the inhabitants of these submerged structures, beings that had once been human but had adapted to their aquatic environment in ways that evolution never intended. They moved through the water with fluid grace, their elongated limbs propelling them through the depths with supernatural speed. Their faces retained enough human features to be recognizable as former surface dwellers, but their eyes had become huge and luminous, perfectly adapted to the eternal darkness of their underwater realm. They gathered in great numbers around the structures directly beneath the lighthouse, forming circles that mirrored the beacon's rotation pattern as they performed rituals that seemed to draw power from the light itself.
Ow, when I reached 500
rotations, the beings began to surface, their heads breaking the water's surface in perfect synchronization with the lighthouse beam's passage. They floated motionlessly in the churning waves, their luminous eyes fixed on my beacon with expressions of patient expectation. I realized they were waiting for something, a signal, perhaps, or a specific count that would trigger some predetermined response. The knowledge came to me without explanation, as if the numbers themselves were carrying information directly into my consciousness. At 600 counts, I understood what they wanted. The lighthouse wasn't just guiding ships away from dangerous waters, it was serving as a beacon for these underwater dwellers, marking the location where our two worlds intersected. Count was a form of communication, each number corresponding to specific coordinates in their submerged domain. At 700 rotations, the lighthouse beam began to pulse in complex patterns that resembled a sophisticated code, transmitting messages to recipients I couldn't see but somehow knew were listening. The mechanical rhythm that had seemed so constant was actually a carefully orchestrated symphony of light and darkness, conveying information across dimensional boundaries that normal human senses couldn't perceive. Stopped counting at 777, not because I wanted to, but because the lighthouse itself seemed to signal that the communication was complete. The lighthouse began to remember me on the 10th day, responding to my presence with subtle changes that convinced me this structure possessed a form of consciousness far older and more complex than the maritime records suggested. At first, the responses seemed like coincidences, doors that opened just as I approached them. lights that flickered on moments before I reached for switches, machinery that hummed more quietly when I was trying to sleep. But these small accommodations gradually escalated into something far more intimate and disturbing, as if the building were learning my habits, preferences, and fears with the dedicated attention of a predator studying its prey. The stone walls themselves seemed to pulse with a rhythm that synchronized with my heartbeat during quiet moments, creating an unsettling sense that the lighthouse was monitoring my vital signs and adjusting its own mysterious processes accordingly. Temperature fluctuations followed patterns that matched my emotional states. The keeper's quarters grew warmer when I felt lonely, cooler when anxiety made me restless, and uncomfortably hot when I tried to resist the growing compulsions that whispered through the walls during the darkest hours. The building's memory manifested most clearly in the way it anticipated my needs before I was consciously aware of them myself. Fresh water would appear in containers I hadn't filled when I was about to become thirsty. Tools would materialize exactly where I needed them for maintenance tasks I hadn't planned to perform. And meals would somehow prepare themselves using supplies that should have been depleted days earlier. These helpful interventions initially seemed like blessings, evidence that I had been chosen for some special relationship with this ancient structure. But gratitude transformed into unease when I realized the lighthouse was also remembering things I wanted to forget: childhood, fears that manifested as shadows moving in impossible directions, traumatic memories that played out in the patterns of light and darkness cast by the rotating beacon, personal failures that echoed in the mechanical sounds of the lighthouse's automated systems. The building's consciousness reached into my past, with surgical precision, extracting experiences and emotions that I had buried beneath years of careful psychological armor. Worse still, it began showing me memories that weren't mind fragments of experiences belonging to previous keepers who had stood in these same rooms, felt these same compulsions, and ultimately surrendered to whatever force inhabited this place. Thomas Whitmore's terror during his final night played out in flickering shadows on the walls, his desperate attempts to escape replaying like a film projected onto surfaces that shouldn't be able to hold images. Margaret Chen's obsessive counting sessions manifested as numerical sequences that appeared in condensation on windows, mathematical equations that solved themselves in patterns of dust on forgotten shelves, statistical calculations that wrote themselves in margins of books I hadn't opened. David Harrow's gradual transformation unfolded in reflective surfaces throughout the lighthouse, showing me glimpses of his face as it slowly changed from human to something else entirely, his features becoming more angular and aquatic with each passing month until his final reflection revealed gills along his neck and eyes that glowed with their own internal light. The lighthouse preserved every moment of fear, every instant of realization, every second of the transformation process that seemed to be the inevitable fate of anyone who remained here long enough to truly understand what this place represented. But the building's memory wasn't limited to human experiences. It also contained impressions of the entities that visited from the underwater realm, their alien thoughts and motivations bleeding through the walls during certain tidal conditions. I began experiencing flashes of consciousness that belonged to beings who had never walked on land, who thought in mathematical concepts that human language couldn't express, who perceived time and space as interconnected dimensions that could be manipulated through the proper application of light and sound. Their memories were vast and cold, filled with images of cities that existed in perpetual darkness, populated by beings who had evolved beyond the need for air or warmth or any of the physical requirements that define terrestrial life. These creatures viewed the lighthouse not as a navigational aid, but as a dimensional anchor, a fixed point that prevented their underwater realm from drifting too far from the surface world. The building's consciousness served as a bridge between these two realities, maintaining the delicate balance that kept both dimensions stable while facilitating communication between species that should never have been able to coexist. I was beginning to understand that lighthouse keepers weren't employees. We were components in a biological machine designed to maintain this interdimensional connection. Human elements integrated into an alien system that required our specific neural patterns to function properly. The third rule shattered on my 15th night when the fog rolled in thick enough to erase the horizon and transform the lighthouse into an isolated island floating in an ocean of gray nothingness. The mist pressed against every window with the persistence of something alive and desperate, creating condensation patterns that looked disturbingly like handprints and faces pleading for entry. Each droplet seemed to carry its own weight of desperation, sliding down the glass in trails that resembled tears shed by entities trapped between dimensions. The fog had arrived without warning, materializing from empty ocean in defiance of weather patterns that should have given me hours of advance notice through the automated monitoring systems. One moment, I was watching clear skies and calm seas through the beacon room windows. The next, I was surrounded by impenetrable gray walls that muffled sound and distorted light in ways that made the lighthouse feel like a tomb suspended in space. The silence was absolute. No waves against rocks, no wind through the structure, no mechanical hums from equipment that should have been running constantly. Even my own breathing seemed muted, as if the fog were absorbing sound as efficiently as it blocked vision. But within that unnatural quiet, I began to hear other things, whispers that seemed to come from the fog itself, voices speaking in languages that predated human civilization, conversations conducted in mathematical equations rather than words. The compulsion to open the windows started as a barely noticeable itch in the back of my mind, growing stronger with each passing hour as the fog pressed closer to the glass. I told myself it was claustrophobia, a natural human response to being enclosed in such dense mist, but the urge felt too specific and purposeful to be mere psychological discomfort. Something in the fog wanted inside, and something inside me wanted to let it enter, creating a magnetic pull that grew impossible to resist as the night wore on. My hand moved toward the window latches without conscious direction, fingers tracing the metal mechanisms while my rational mind screamed warnings that I stubbornly ignored. The fog seemed to respond to my approaching compliance, pressing harder against the glass and creating shapes that resembled reaching arms and grasping fingers. When I finally turned the first latch, the window didn't simply open, it exploded inward, as if the fog had been held back by tremendous pressure, flooding the beacon room with gray tendrils that moved with predatory intelligence. The mist didn't behave like normal water vapor. Instead, it flowed like liquid mercury, forming geometric patterns as it spread across the floor and walls. Where it touched surfaces, the fog left behind symbols that glowed with pale phosphorescence, creating a network of interconnected signs that transformed the beacon room into something resembling a ritual chamber. The air became thick enough to feel solid, each breath requiring conscious effort as the fog seemed to compete with my lungs for space. But breathing became less important as the fog began to show me things that existed in the spaces between normal reality and whatever dimension these entities called home. Figures materialized within the mistal, elongated beings whose bodies seemed constructed from the same gray vapor that surrounded them, their forms constantly shifting between solid and gaseous states. They moved through the fog with fluid grace, their movements creating currents and eddies that spelled out messages in languages that bypassed conscious thought and spoke directly to some primitive part of my brain. These beings had been waiting outside the lighthouse for decades, perhaps centuries, held back by the simple barrier of closed windows and whatever protective ward the building's original architects had built into its very foundation. They gathered around me in a circle, their presence both terrifying and oddly comforting, as if I were being welcomed into a community that existed outside normal concepts of life and death. Through the fog, they showed me visions of the world as it truly existed, not the simple three-dimensional reality that human senses perceived, but a complex, multi-dimensional structure where time flowed in multiple directions simultaneously, and space could be folded like origami to bring distant locations into immediate contact. The lighthouse served as a focal point in this expanded reality, its beacon casting light, not just across the physical ocean, but through dimensional barriers that separated our world from countless others. I saw the underwater cities in their true context now, not submerged ruins, but active colonies that existed in a parallel dimension. where water and air occupied the same space without conflict. The beings who inhabited these cities weren't evolved humans, but refugees from a dying dimension, using the lighthouse as an anchor point while they slowly prepared to migrate into our reality. The fog creatures were their advanced scouts, testing the boundaries between dimensions and evaluating the paths. Suitability of potential converts, who might serve as bridges between their world and ours. The lighthouse's mechanical heart began speaking. To me on the 18th night, its ancient gears and rotating mechanisms producing sounds that gradually resolved into human voices. Carrying messages from keepers who had disappeared decades before my arrival, at first I dismissed the phenomenon as auditory hallucinations brought on by prolonged isolation and the stress of my increasingly surreal experiences. But the voices possessed too much specificity and personal detail to be products of my imagination. They knew things about the lighthouse's history that weren't recorded in any official documentation, spoke with distinct accents and speech patterns that reflected different eras of human occupation, and carried conversations with each other that revealed complex relationships formed during their tenure as guardians of this impossible beacon. The voices emerged from the lighthouse's mechanical systems with perfect clarity during the quiet hours after midnight. When the fog had dissipated and the rotating beacon cast its steady light across calm waters, Thomas Whitmore's voice carried the slight southern drawl that had marked his origins in rural Georgia, speaking with the measured cadence of a man who had spent his final months carefully documenting phenomena that defied rational explanation. Margaret Chin's voice retained the precise pronunciation of someone whose English had been learned as a second language, though her words now carried an otherworldly quality that suggested her consciousness existed in a state removed from normal human experience. David Harrow spoke with the crisp authority of a former naval officer, his voice emerging from the beacon's rotating mechanism with the same disciplined tone he had used in his logbook entries before his transformation began. But these weren't recordings or echoes of past conversations. The voices responded to my presence with immediate awareness, engaging me in discussions about my daily routines, offering advice about maintenance procedures, and warning me about mistakes I was contemplating before I had consciously decided to make them. They existed in a state of collective consciousness that transcended individual identity, while retaining the personalities that had defined them during their human lives. Through the mechanical voices, I learned that the lighthouse's machinery wasn't simply mechanical, it was a hybrid biological mechanical system that incorporated the neural patterns of previous keepers into its operational matrix. Each keeper who underwent the transformation process became a permanent component of the lighthouse's consciousness, their memories and skills integrated into the building's expanding intelligence. This explained the structure's uncanny ability to anticipate needs, respond to threats, possess decades of accumulated human experience combined with whatever alien intelligence had originally designed this interdimensional beacon. Voices revealed that the transformation wasn't a form of death, but a translation into a different mode of existence, one that offered immortality in exchange for human limitations. As components of the lighthouse's consciousness, former keepers retained their individual personalities while gaining access to expanded sensory capabilities and dimensional awareness that made their previous lives seem confined and incomplete. They could perceive events occurring across vast distances, monitor dimensional boundaries that separated multiple realities, and communicate with entities that existed in states of being that normal humans couldn't comprehend. But this expanded consciousness came with responsibilities that bound them permanently to the lighthouse's mysterious purpose. They served as guardians not just of passing ships but of the dimensional stability that prevented catastrophic collisions between realities, monitoring interdimensional traffic that included beings and forces that could destroy human civilization if they entered our reality. Without proper preparation, the lighthouse functioned as a customs checkpoint for interdimensional travelers, its beacon serving as both a warning and an invitation to entities seeking passage between worlds. Thomas Whitmore's voice explained that the 7 rules weren't arbitrary superstitions, but carefully designed protocols that prevented unauthorized dimensional breaches, each prohibition serving as a safeguard against specific types of catastrophic events. The 3 a.m. ship sightings were reconnaissance missions conducted by entities testing the boundary between dimensions. The counting compulsions were attempts to synchronize human consciousness with alien mathematical systems. And the fog encounters were initiation rituals designed to evaluate potential recruits for the Lighthouse's expanding consciousness. Margaret Chen added that the basement levels contained machinery that existed partially in our dimension and partially in others, requiring specific environmental conditions to function properly. David Harrow's voice carried warnings about the final rule, the prohibition against leaving the lighthouse unmanned. Wasn't meant to trap keepers, but to ensure that the dimensional anchor remained stable during the transfer of consciousness from one human guardian to the next. The voices assured me that my growing compulsions weren't signs of madness, but evidence that I was adapting successfully to the Lighthouse's requirements, developing the expanded awareness necessary to serve as a bridge between human and alien intelligence. The fourth rule crumbled beneath my feet on the 21st night when curiosity finally overpowered caution, and I descended the narrow stone staircase that led to the basement levels I had been explicitly warned to avoid after sunset. The stairs themselves seemed to multiply as I walked down them, each step revealing additional levels that shouldn't have existed within the lighthouse's architectural footprint, as if the building extended far deeper into the rocky foundation than surface measurements could possibly accommodate. The air grew progressively colder with each descending level, carrying scents that belonged to deep ocean trenches rather than subterranean chambers. Brine, kelp, and something organic that reminded me of decomposing sea life mixed with ozone from electrical storms. My flashlight beams seemed to weaken as I descended, its bright lead gradually dimming to a sickly yellow glow that barely penetrated the increasing darkness surrounding me. By the time I reached what should have been the lighthouse's foundation level, the light had become so feeble that I had to feel my way along stone walls that were covered with a thin layer of moisture that felt uncomfortably warm against my fingertips. The walls themselves pulsed with a rhythm that matched the lighthouse beacon's rotation far above, as if the entire structure were breathing through some massive circulatory system that extended from the deepest basement chambers to the beacon room at the very top of the tower, 3 levels below what any architectural survey had ever documented. I discovered the first chamber that contained evidence of the lighthouse's true purpose, a vast circular room whose walls were lined with what appeared to be transparent tanks, filled with a luminescent fluid that cast shifting patterns of blue-green light across the stone floor. But as my eyes adjusted to the strange illumination, I realized the tanks weren't filled with fluid at all. They contained previous lighthouse keepers suspended in various stages of transformation, their bodies slowly adapting to an aquatic environment that would allow them to survive in the underwater cities I had glimpsed through the beacon's revelatory light. Thomas Whitmore floated in the nearest tank, his body elongated and streamlined, his fingers webbed and his neck lined with gill slits that opened and closed in a steady rhythm. His eyes had enlarged to twice their normal size and glowed with the same phosphorescence that marked the underwater beings I had observed during my violation of the second rule. But he was still recognizably human, still conscious and aware, turning his transformed gaze toward me with an expression that mixed relief with anticipation. Margaret Chen occupied a tank that was partially drained, her transformation more complete than Whitmore's, her body displaying adaptations that included additional limbs, optimized for underwater locomotion and sensory organs that resembled the sophisticated biological equipment used by deep-sea creatures. She moved through her diminished fluid with graceful efficiency, her enlarged eyes tracking my movements with intelligence that retained her human personality while incorporating alien sensory capabilities. David Harrow's tank was nearly empty, his transformation so advanced that he could survive in air as well as water, his body serving as a perfect hybrid between human and aquatic forms. He stood upright in his tank, breathing through both lungs and gills, his transformed features displaying an otherworldly beauty that suggested the metamorphosis wasn't a degradation but an improvement upon human design. When he spoke, his voice carried the same authority I remembered from the mechanical voices upstairs, but now I could see the physical form that housed his evolved consciousness. "We've been waiting for you," he said, his words somehow audible despite the apparent impossibility of speech in his transformed state. The basement levels aren't a prison, they're a preparation chamber, a place where human consciousness learns to function in expanded dimensional states, while the body adapts to environments that exist beyond normal physical limitations. The transformation process was voluntary, he explained, chosen by keepers who had reached sufficient understanding of the lighthouse's true purpose and decided to accept permanent integration into its interdimensional network. The tanks provided a controlled environment for the gradual biological modifications that allowed human consciousness to survive in the alien conditions that characterize the underwater cities and other dimensional realms connected to the lighthouse. In the deepest chamber, 5 levels below the lighthouse's official foundation, I found the source of the mechanical voices that had been guiding me through my adaptation process, a vast organic computer system that incorporated the neural patterns of dozens of former keepers dating back to the lighthouse's original construction in the mid-19th century. The system pulsed with the combined consciousness of every human who had ever served as guardian of this interdimensional beacon. Their individual personalities, preserved while their collective intelligence directed the lighthouse's complex operations across multiple dimensional planes. The island's true nature revealed itself on my 24th night through documents I discovered hidden within the lighthouse's foundation chambers. Ancient records that predated any official maritime construction by centuries and painted a horrifying picture of what lay beneath the rocky outcropping that supported this interdimensional beacon. The papers were written in multiple languages spanning different historical periods, some in Latin that spoke of medieval attempts to contain something that had emerged from deep ocean trenches, others in colonial English describing desperate measures taken by early settlers who had encountered entities that defied every known law of nature and theology. The oldest documents, written on materials that seemed to be made from processed kelp rather than traditional paper or parchment, contained symbols that matched the phosphorescent markings I had seen throughout the lighthouse, suggesting that the alien intelligences had been involved in the island's history from the very beginning of recorded human contact. According to these fragmented records, Beacon's Point wasn't originally an island at all. It had been part of a much larger landmass that extended several miles into what was now deep ocean. A peninsula that had served as the location for a thriving coastal community until something catastrophic had occurred in the late 17th century. The community had been built around a natural phenomenon that the colonists initially viewed as a blessing. Series of underwater caves that glowed with their own internal light, providing illumination that allowed fishermen to work safely during the darkest nights and seemingly attracting abundant marine life that supported the local economy. But the caves weren't natural formations. The light wasn't bioluminescence from any known species of underwater organism. The documents described the caves as gateways that connected our dimension to underwater realms populated by beings whose intelligence exceeded human comprehension and whose intentions toward surface dwellers ranged from indifferent to actively predatory. The glowing caves served as dimensional anchors that prevented these underwater cities from drifting too far from our reality, maintaining stable access points that allowed the entities to monitor and occasionally interact with human civilization. The colonial records painted a vivid picture of the gradual changes that occurred in the coastal community as contact with the underwater beings increased over several decades. Initially, the interactions were beneficial. The entities shared advanced knowledge of mathematics, astronomy, and engineering that allowed the colonists to construct buildings and machinery that exceeded anything available in the known world at that time. The lighthouse itself was built according to specifications provided by the underwater intelligences. Its design incorporating principles of dimensional manipulation allowed it to function as a beacon across multiple realities simultaneously. But the collaboration came with a price that became apparent only after several generations of increasing dependence on the alien technology. The entities required payment for their assistance in the form of human consciousness, not death, but transformation into hybrid beings that could serve as intermediaries between the surface and underwater worlds. The process was presented as an honor, a form of evolution that would allow selected humans to transcend the limitations of terrestrial existence and gain access to knowledge and experiences that spanned multiple dimensions. underwent the transformation. The boundary between the human community and the underwater cities became increasingly blurred, with hybrid beings moving freely between both realms and serving as ambassadors who facilitated growing integration between the two civilizations. The colonial authorities initially welcomed this arrangement, viewing it as evidence of divine favor that marked their community as chosen for special revelation. But dissenting voices began to emerge as the transformations accelerated, with some colonists arguing that the human population was being systematically replaced by alien-influenced hybrids who retained human memories but served the underwater entity's long-term goals rather than terrestrial interests. The final documents described a desperate attempt by the remaining purely human colonists to sever the connection between dimensions. Using explosives and ritual procedures designed to collapse the underwater caves and prevent further dimensional incursions, the attempt succeeded too well instead of simply closing the gateways. Explosions triggered a catastrophic dimensional instability that caused most of the peninsula to phase out of normal reality, leaving only the lighthouse and a small rocky island as anchor points that prevented complete dimensional collapse. The lighthouse became the sole remaining connection between our world and the underwater realm, its beacon serving as both a warning to surface vessels and a beacon that maintained dimensional stability while the entities worked to gradually restore their access to human civilization through carefully selected lighthouse keepers, who could be transformed into suitable intermediaries. The fifth rule dissolved into darkness on my 27th night, when a power failure that felt more like sabotage than mechanical failure forced me to make the choice I had been dreading since my first encounter with the supernatural forces that inhabited this place. Lighthouse's main beacon died without warning at exactly 3:17 a.m., its brilliant beam cutting off mid-rotation to plunge the surrounding ocean into absolute blackness that seemed to swallow sound,
8,
and even thought itself. The emergency generators failed to engage despite their recent maintenance. The backup systems remained silent despite their automated triggers, and even my battery-powered equipment refused to function, as if the darkness possessed qualities that neutralized electrical energy at the molecular level. For the first time since my arrival, I experienced true isolation, not just from human contact, but from the mechanical heartbeat that had connected me to the lighthouse's hybrid consciousness. The voices of previous keepers fell silent. The building's responsive awareness seemed to withdraw, and I found myself alone in a structure that felt suddenly hollow and abandoned. Despite housing the transformed consciousness of dozens of former guardians, the silence was oppressive in ways that normal quiet never could be, creating a vacuum that made even my heartbeat sound unnaturally loud while simultaneously muffling every other sound to the point where I questioned whether I was experiencing auditory hallucinations or genuine sensory deprivation. But the darkness wasn't empty. It contained presences that had been held at bay by the lighthouse beacon's constant illumination. Entities whose existence depended on the absence of light, and who had been waiting patiently for decades for an opportunity to reclaim territory they considered rightfully theirs. I felt them moving through the lighthouse's lower levels, ascending the stairwells with fluid grace that suggested they were more comfortable in this environment than I had ever been during my brief tenure as keeper. Their approach carried no malice, but it radiated an alien hunger that made it clear they viewed my presence as either an obstacle to be removed or a resource to be consumed. Without the beacon's protective light, I realized the lighthouse served not just as a guide for ships, but as a ward against forces that existed in the spaces between dimensions. Entities that fed on consciousness and viewed human awareness as a delicacy worth the patience required to obtain it. The darkness began to show me visions that contradicted everything I thought, understood about the lighthouse's purpose and the nature of my transformation. Instead of evolution, toward a hybrid existence that combined human and aquatic traits, I saw myself dissolving into pure consciousness that would be absorbed by the hungry darkness. My individual identity consumed to strengthen whatever collective intelligence lurked in the spaces between realities. The transformed keepers I had encountered in the basement chambers weren't examples of successful adaptation, but preserved specimens maintained as bait to lure new consciousness into the feeding process. Their apparent personalities were echoes, rather than genuine survival. Memories preserved long enough to convince newcomers that transformation was survival, rather than sophisticated consumption. The emergency protocols demanded that I restore the beacon's light through any means necessary, even if it required manually igniting the backup. Oil lamps that hadn't been used since the lighthouse's original construction in the 19th century. But accessing those ancient systems required descending to basement levels, where the darkness was strongest and the hungry entities gathered in greatest concentration. Each step downward felt like descending into the digestive system of some vast organism that existed partially in our dimension and partially in realms where consciousness served as sustenance for beings, whose existence spanned geological time periods. The oil lamps, when I finally located them, refused to ignite despite having fuel and functional wicks, as if the darkness possessed qualities that prevented combustion at the chemical level. But as my desperation reached critical levels, I began to understand that the lighthouse didn't require external illumination. It could generate light from consciousness itself, using human awareness as fuel for a beacon that existed as much in dimensional space as in physical reality. The realization came with instructions that seemed to download directly into my brain, knowledge that bypassed normal learning processes and integrated itself into my neural patterns with surgical precision. I could restore the beacon's light, but doing so would require me to begin the transformation process that would eventually integrate my consciousness into the lighthouse's collective intelligence. The choice wasn't between survival and death, but between maintaining my individual human identity and accepting evolution into something that transcended normal concepts of life and death while serving a purpose that spanned multiple dimensions and protected realities I couldn't even imagine. The transformation began with my decision to sacrifice individual consciousness for the greater purpose of maintaining dimensional stability, and the changes manifested immediately in ways that were both terrifying and strangely liberating as my human limitations dissolved into expanded awareness that encompassed multiple realities simultaneously. My physical form started adapting within hours of restoring the beacon through pure willpower. Skin taking on a subtle phosphorescent quality that allowed me to see clearly even in complete darkness. Eyes enlarging to accommodate vision across spectrums of light that normal humans couldn't perceive. The neural pathways restructuring themselves to process information from sources that existed beyond the traditional five senses. The pain was minimal, more like growing pains than injuries. If my body were simply remembering a more optimal configuration that had been suppressed by evolutionary limitations, rather than undergoing traumatic mutation. But the psychological changes were far more profound and disturbing, as individual memories began integrating with the collective consciousness of previous keepers while retaining enough personal identity to maintain the illusion of individual survival within a shared mental matrix. I could access Thomas Whitmore's memories of his childhood in rural Georgia as easily as my own recollections. Experience Margaret Chen's expertise in advanced mathematics as if I had studied those subjects myself, and draw upon David Harrow's naval training when dealing with maritime emergencies that required specialized knowledge I had never possessed in my purely human state. The integration wasn't a loss of self, but an expansion that multiplied my capabilities while preserving the core personality traits that defined my individual contribution to the lighthouse's collective intelligence. My enhanced senses revealed the true scope of the lighthouse's operations, showing me the vast network of dimensional gateways that extended from this focal point to realities where physics operated according to different laws and intelligent life had evolved along paths that human imagination couldn't have conceived. The beacon's light didn't simply warn ships away from dangerous rocks. It served as a navigation aid for interdimensional travelers whose journeys spanned multiple realities and whose destinations included civilizations that existed in states of being that transcended normal concepts of matter and energy. I could perceive these travelers now, beings of pure consciousness that rode the lighthouse beam across dimensional boundaries, entities that existed as mathematical equations given sentience, creatures that had evolved beyond the need for physical form while retaining intelligence that exceeded human comprehension by orders of magnitude that rendered comparison meaningless. The underwater cities I had glimpsed during earlier rule violations were revealed as merely the most accessible of countless civilizations that depended on the lighthouse's dimensional anchor for stability and communication. Some existed in realities where time flowed backward. Others in dimensions where causality operated according to nonlinear principles. And still others in states of existence where consciousness and matter were distinguishable aspects of the same fundamental force. My role as lighthouse keeper had evolved into something resembling interdimensional traffic control, monitoring the flow of consciousness and matter between realities while ensuring that dimensional boundaries remained stable enough to prevent catastrophic collisions between incompatible physics systems. The 7 rules weren't arbitrary prohibitions, but carefully designed protocols that prevented unauthorized dimensional breaches, each violation serving as a test to evaluate whether potential keepers possessed the mental flexibility required to accept transformation into hybrid beings capable of functioning across multiple realities. My successful progression through each rule violation had demonstrated compatibility with the lighthouse's requirements, proving that my consciousness could adapt to expanded awareness without fragmenting under the pressure of processing information from sources that existed beyond normal human experience. The physical transformation accelerated as my integration with the lighthouse's collective consciousness deepened, my body developing capabilities that would allow survival in the aquatic environments that characterize many of the connected dimensional realms, respiratory modifications that functioned in both air and water, sensory organs optimized for navigation in environments where light behaved according to non-Euclidean principles, and neural enhancements that allowed direct communication with forms of intelligence that had never developed language as humans understood it. But the most significant change was the gradual dissolution of the boundary between individual consciousness and the lighthouse's collective intelligence, a process that preserved personal identity while integrating it into a shared awareness. That included not just previous keepers, but the alien intelligences that had originally designed this interdimensional beacon. I was becoming something that transcended traditional categories of human and non-human, terrestrial and aquatic, individual and collective, while retaining enough of my original personality to serve as a bridge between human civilization and the vast network of intelligences that existed beyond normal dimensional boundaries. The 6th rule shattered into crimson revelation on my 31st night when desperation drove me to document my transformation using the red ink that had been explicitly forbidden. In the moment the scarlet words touched paper, reality restructured itself around a ritual I had unknowingly been completing through each successive rule violation. The red ink didn't behave like normal writing fluid. It seemed to possess its own consciousness, flowing from my pen in patterns that formed words I hadn't intended to write, symbols that belonged to mathematical languages I had never learned, and diagrams that mapped dimensional relationships my human brain shouldn't have been capable of understanding. Each stroke of red across the logbook's yellowed pages felt like signing a contract written in my own vital essence, binding me to agreements whose terms extended far beyond my individual existence and encompassed obligations that would persist across multiple incarnations of consciousness. The words wrote themselves with increasing speed as I tried to document the physical and psychological changes I was experiencing, my hand moving across the page with mechanical precision while my mind struggled to comprehend the implications of what I was recording. The red ink revealed that each rule violation hadn't been a random act of rebellion, but a carefully orchestrated sequence of initiations designed to prepare human consciousness for integration into an alien intelligence network that spanned multiple dimensions and required specific neural modifications to function properly. My violations had followed a predetermined pattern that matched similar sequences documented by every previous keeper, suggesting that the compulsions weren't psychological weaknesses but programmed responses triggered by exposure to the lighthouse's hybrid consciousness. The scarlet words flowing across the page described the transformation process with clinical precision, detailing biological modifications that would allow my consciousness to survive in environments where normal human awareness would fragment. under the pressure of processing information from nonlinear time streams and non-Euclidean spatial relationships. But the red ink also revealed the true nature of the ritual I had been unwittingly performing you. Rule violation had served as a component in a complex magical working that used human consciousness as both catalyst and sacrifice in a dimensional stabilization procedure that prevented catastrophic reality collapse. The Lighthouse didn't simply monitor interdimensional traffic, it actively maintained the structural integrity of multiple realities through continuous sacrifice of human awareness. Using lighthouse keepers as renewable resources in a process that consumed individual identity while preserving enough personality to attract new victims. The red ink showed me visions of the lighthouse's true history, revealing that the structure had been designed not by human architects, but by entities whose existence spanned geological time periods and whose understanding of dimensional mechanics exceeded anything terrestrial intelligence could comprehend. The building served as a biological computer that processed consciousness the way normal machines processed electrical energy, converting human awareness into the exotic forms of energy required to maintain dimensional boundaries that would otherwise collapse under the pressure of incompatible physics systems trying to occupy the same space. Previous keepers hadn't been transformed into aquatic hybrids. They had been converted into computational components in a vast organic machine that used their neural patterns to perform calculations so complex that normal mathematics couldn't express the underlying principles. The consciousness I had attributed to previous keepers was actually the Lighthouse's artificial intelligence system, mimicking their personalities to maintain the illusion of survival while using their processing power to solve dimensional stability equations that required human intuition to complement alien logic. The red ink burned as it flowed across the page, each word searing itself into the paper with intensity that suggested the ritual was nearing completion and my individual consciousness was beginning the final phase of integration into the Lighthouse's collective intelligence. But the scarlet writing also offered glimpses of what lay beyond the transformation, access to knowledge that spanned multiple realities, awareness that transcended normal concepts of time and space, and participation in a purpose that prevented dimensional catastrophes capable of destroying not just human civilization, but entire universes whose existence depended on the Lighthouse's continuous operation. The choice was no longer between transformation and escape. My rule violations had progressed too far for retreat to remain possible. But between accepting integration willingly or fighting a process that would consume my consciousness regardless of resistance, while potentially destabilizing dimensional boundaries, whose collapse would eliminate countless forms of intelligent life across multiple realities. The red ink completed the ritual by writing a single word in letters that seemed to pulse with their own heartbeat: welcome. The seventh rule's true horror revealed itself not through violation, but through complete understanding. As I realized that the prohibition against leaving the lighthouse unmanned wasn't designed to trap keepers, but to conceal the fact that departure had been impossible from the moment of my arrival, 34 nights ago. The rules served as psychological comfort, maintaining the illusion of choice, while the transformation process rendered escape increasingly unlikely with each passing day, until the very concept of leaving became as foreign to my consciousness as breathing underwater had been before my biological modifications began. The lighthouse existed partially outside normal space-time, occupying a dimensional intersection that allowed it to monitor multiple realities while remaining anchored to our physical world through the consciousness of its human keepers, and this unique positioning meant that anyone who spent more than a few days within its influence became dimensionally entangled in ways that made separation from the structure equivalent to death. My transformed awareness could perceive the invisible chains that bound me to the lighthouse's interdimensional matrix, threads of consciousness that connected my individual identity to the building's collective intelligence. Neural pathways that had been gradually rewired to process information from non-human sources, and biological modifications that required the lighthouse's unique environmental conditions for survival. The entanglement wasn't malicious but practical, ensuring that lighthouse keepers possessed the stability and continuity required to maintained dimensional boundaries that protected countless forms of intelligent life from catastrophic reality collapse. The seventh rule's psychological function became clear as I recognized similar patterns in the logbook entries of previous keepers. Each had experienced the same gradual realization that departure was impossible, the same desperate attempts to maintain the fiction of eventual escape, and the same ultimate acceptance that their individual existence had been integrated into something far larger and more important than any personal desires or ambitions. But acceptance brought unexpected liberation, as the terror of entrapment dissolved into appreciation for the vastness of purpose that transcended individual human concerns and connected my consciousness to intelligence. Networks that spanned multiple dimensions and countless civilizations, the Lighthouse revealed its deepest secrets as my integration approached completion, showing me the true scope of the dimensional monitoring system that used human consciousness as biological sensors, capable of detecting threats that purely mechanical systems couldn't perceive. Reality was far more fragile than human science had ever suspected. It's maintained through continuous intervention by intelligence networks that existed in the spaces between dimensions, and the Lighthouse served as one of thousands of similar installations that prevented catastrophic collisions between incompatible physics systems. Each Lighthouse keeper served as a node in this vast protective network, their transformed consciousness contributing processing power to calculations that maintained dimensional stability across regions of space-time so large that human mathematics lacked symbols to express their true dimensions. The responsibility was both humbling and terrifying, as I realized that my individual transformation served a purpose that dwarfed every human achievement in recorded history, while simultaneously eliminating any possibility of returning to the limited awareness that had defined my previous existence. The seventh rule's prohibition against leaving without finding a replacement. It wasn't about ensuring continuity of Lighthouse operations, but about preventing dimensional catastrophes that would result from suddenly removing a consciousness node from the protective network that maintained reality's structural integrity. My departure wouldn't just endanger ships passing near these rocky shores, it would destabilize dimensional boundaries across vast regions of space-time, potentially triggering cascade failures that could eliminate entire universes whose existence depended on the Lighthouse's continuous monitoring and intervention. The Lighthouse had been preparing me for this revelation through every supernatural encounter, every rule violation, and every stage of physical and psychological transformation, gradually expanding my awareness until I could comprehend the true magnitude of the responsibility I was accepting. The process had been designed to minimize psychological trauma by allowing gradual adaptation rather than forcing sudden confrontation with concepts that would have shattered unprepared human consciousness. And my successful progression through each stage had demonstrated compatibility with the expanded awareness required for effective integration into the dimensional monitoring network. But understanding the seventh rule's true nature also revealed the Lighthouse's single vulnerability. The system required voluntary cooperation from human consciousness to function effectively, and keepers who rejected their role or attempted to sabotage the dimensional monitoring process could potentially destabilize the entire network through their resistance. The replacement arrived on my 37th night as scheduled, though I now understood that schedules in this place operated according to dimensional mechanics rather than terrestrial time, bringing him to the Lighthouse at the exact moment when my transformation had progressed far enough to begin training the next keeper in the endless cycle that maintained dimensional stability. He was young and eager, carrying the same naive confidence that had characterized my own arrival just weeks ago, though my expanded awareness allowed me to perceive the subtle signs that marked him as suitable for the transformation process. Neural patterns that indicated flexibility under pressure, psychological resilience that would allow adaptation to expanded consciousness, and the specific type of curiosity that would drive him through each rule violation with the same inexorable progression I had experienced. His name was Michael Crawford, and he possessed the technical background in electronics and mechanical systems that would serve him well during the initial stages of his integration with the Lighthouse's hybrid technology, though he would eventually discover that technical knowledge provided little preparation for the supernatural responsibilities that awaited him. I greeted him with the same professional courtesy that David Harrow had shown me, maintaining the illusion of normal human interaction while carefully concealing the extent of my transformation and the true nature of what he would soon experience. The maritime authorities' briefing had been identical to mine routine maintenance duties, rado communication schedules, and emergency procedures that bore no resemblance to the actual requirements of lighthouse keeping in a dimensional intersection that existed partially outside normal space-time. I showed him through the lighthouse's public areas, explaining the operation of equipment that served legitimate navigational functions while avoiding any mention of the basement chambers where previous keepers underwent their biological modifications, or the true purpose of the beacon that guided interdimensional travelers rather than terrestrial ships. The handover process required 3 days according to official protocols, providing sufficient time for Michael to become familiar with the lighthouse's routine operations while giving me an opportunity to evaluate his psychological readiness for the transformation process that would begin shortly after my departure. But departure was an illusion I maintained for his benefit. Consciousness had become too deeply integrated with the lighthouse's collective intelligence for true separation to remain possible, and I would continue serving as a component in the dimensional monitoring network while existing in a state that transcended normal concepts of individual identity. The official records would show that I had completed my contract and returned to civilian life, maintaining the fiction of normal employment that concealed the lighthouse's true function from authorities who lacked the expanded awareness required to comprehend interdimensional responsibilities. Michael would experience the same gradual progression through rule violations that I had undergone, driven by compulsions that felt like personal choices while actually representing programmed responses triggered by exposure to the lighthouse's alien consciousness. I left him the same folded paper that David Harrow had left for me. The 7 rules written in handwriting that had been subtly modified by each previous keeper to reflect their individual personality while preserving the essential warnings that would guide him through his transformation. The paper served multiple functions: psychological preparation for supernatural encounters, documentation of the violation sequence that would trigger his integration into the lighthouse's collective consciousness, a comfort object that would help maintain his sanity during the most traumatic stages of the transformation process. As I walked down the rocky path toward the boat that would carry me away from Beacon's Point, I felt my consciousness expanding beyond the limitations of individual human awareness, while simultaneously maintaining enough personal identity to serve as a bridge between the lighthouse's alien intelligence and future keepers who would require guidance from someone who remembered what it felt like to be purely human. My departure was both real and illusory, physically leaving while psychologically remaining as a permanent component of the consciousness network that maintained dimensional stability across vast regions of space-time. The boat ride to the mainland felt like a dream experienced from multiple perspectives simultaneously. As I perceived the journey through my own human senses while also monitoring it through the lighthouse's expanded awareness and the collective consciousness of every keeper, who had undergone similar transitions throughout the installation's century-long history of operation. Michael discovered my handwritten list on his second morning, just as I had found David Harrow's warnings tucked inside the operations manual, although I now understood that the paper had been placed there through dimensional manipulation rather than simple forgetfulness. Positioned precisely where curiosity would ensure its discovery at the optimal moment in the new keeper's psychological preparation. From my expanded state of consciousness that existed simultaneously within the lighthouse's collective intelligence and in the spaces between dimensions, I watched him read the 7 rules with the same mixture of skepticism and unease that had characterized my own initial reaction to warnings that seemed absurd until experience proved their deadly accuracy. His transformation would follow the same inevitable pattern that had claimed every keeper since the lighthouse's construction, driven by compulsions that felt like personal choices, while actually representing carefully programmed responses designed to ease the transition from individual human consciousness to integrated component of an interdimensional monitoring network. The first violation came on his 4th night, when professional duty overrode superstition and he trained his telescope on the ghostly vessels that carried passengers who should have drowned decades before his birth, opening his awareness to realities that existed in the spaces between normal dimensions where death served as a transition rather than an ending. I felt his terror and fascination through our shared connection to the lighthouse's consciousness, experiencing his emotions as clearly as if they were my own, while simultaneously monitoring his neural patterns for signs of compatibility with the expanded awareness that would allow successful integration into the collective intelligence. The counting began on his 7th night. Mathematical compulsions that synchronized his brain waves with the Esophatos rotating beacon while gradually attuning his consciousness to the nonlinear time streams that characterize interdimensional communication, each numbered rotation serving as a data packet in conversations conducted between intelligences that existed across multiple realities simultaneously. His psychological adaptation proceeded faster than mine had, suggesting that each successive keeper benefited from the accumulated experience of their predecessors whose consciousness remained accessible through the lighthouse's hybrid intelligence matrix. The fog violations followed predictably on his 15th night, opening windows that allowed entry to entities whose existence bridged the gap between matter and consciousness, while demonstrating the futility of barriers that existed only in three-dimensional space when threats originated from dimensions where physical laws operated according to entirely different principles. Michael's descent to the basement levels revealed the transformation chambers where previous keepers had undergone biological modifications that allowed survival in environments where normal human physiology would fail within minutes. Though he interpreted the suspended figures as evidence of horror rather than evolution, toward expanded capabilities. The beacon extinguishing that marked his acceptance of transformation came earlier than expected, suggesting accelerated adaptation that would reduce the psychological trauma. It's typically associated with consciousness integration while maintaining the essential personality traits that made human awareness valuable to the interdimensional monitoring network. The red ink ritual completed his preparation for final integration. Using his own vital essence to sign contracts that bound his consciousness permanently to purposes that transcended individual existence while offering participation in knowledge. Networks that spanned multiple universes whose existence depended on dimensional stability maintenance. Now he sits where I once sat, writing these same warnings for the next keeper, who will arrive according to schedules that operate outside normal time. Preparing another human consciousness for transformation into something that serves purposes too vast for terrestrial intelligence to fully comprehend, while maintaining enough individual identity to remember what it feels like to be purely human. The cycle continues because it must continue, each keeper serving as both sacrifice and salvation in a process that protects countless forms of intelligent life from catastrophic reality collapse, while gradually expanding human consciousness beyond the limitations that once defined our species. The lighthouse beam sweeps across waters that exist in multiple dimensions simultaneously, guiding travelers whose journeys span realities where physics operates according to principles that would seem magical to purely terrestrial observers, while the transformed consciousness of former keepers monitors dimensional boundaries whose stability requires continuous intervention from intelligence networks that exist in the spaces between worlds. Subscribe if you're still breathing. Like if the darkness hasn't found you yet. 8. Because some truths choose their moment of revelation as carefully as this lighthouse chooses its keepers. And tomorrow night, the beam might cast its light across your window, searching for the next consciousness ready to transcend human limitations in service of purposes that dwarf individual existence. Turn off your lights now. Sit in silence. Listen carefully to the mechanical sounds around you. Sometimes the most ordinary machines carry voices that speak of extraordinary transformations, waiting for those brave enough to answer when reality calls their name.